Hi everyone, welcome to our presentations. Today our group are going to discuss the topic that large high technology corporations and small labor intensive firms function as the interconnected vessel in the labor market, sustained by precariat, reserve labor, technical rent, and asymmetric supply chain power. And the scope we choose is the Apple with their small supplier. In our presentation are going through introductions and I'll explain some definitions and the industry context. Next is the conceptual framework and our presentation have three arguments. Next is evaluations and last is conclusions. Next about definitions. First of all is last high technology corporation. In this case is Apple. It is the technology leader that create value through innovations, product design, advanced technologies, huge capital investment and intellectual property. Second is small labor intensive firm. In this case is Apple supplier. It is the firm that rely heavily on human labor manufacture and assembly product for a larger company in case supplier. Next is interconnected vessel. Is the firm are economically connected. What we can see is the change in one firm decisions can directly affect to the performance or the labor condition of other firm. Technical rent we can see is the extra profit they earn from technological advantage such as innovation, patent, intellectual property, and brand value. Precarity is the condition of insecure employment with unstable income, limited protection, and uncertain working conditions. Last is reserve labor, is the number of workers available to match firm demand. It can be unemployed, it can be underemployed. Next is the global smartphone industries. So this is a rapidly growing market driven by AI, semiconductor technologies, 5G, and digital ecosystems. It has a globalized supply chain with production activity across multiple countries, and the market follow oligopoly structure, mainly led by Apple, Samsung, Xiaomi, where competitions focus on innovations, product quality, brand reputation, and ecosystem integration. And the reason why we choose Apple because Apple is the one of the world valuable technology company and a global leader in smartphone innovations. They operate a global supply chain involve hundreds of suppliers across multiple countries, and they require very strict standards for quality and environmentally sustainability. So let's talk about the conceptual frameworks. First of all, Apple Technical Rent, which created from its innovation and technological capabilities, increase their bargaining power over supplier. So this creates asymmetric supply chain power where the supplier must adapt to the strict requirement of Apple. So there are two main mechanisms they can mechanizations or they can be labor flexibilities. So through mechanizations, supplier must invest in automations, machinery to increase the productivity or reduce the error of production. So this also create the reserve labor because there will be someone get fired. So, through labor flexibility, supplier can reduce costs by relying more on temporary or seasonal contract worker instead of permanent employees. So this also increase the precariat labor, referring to the worker with unstable employment conditions. So reserve labor provide a pool of worker willing to accept the insecure jobs, while precariat worker can return to the reserve labor pool when their contract ends. At the same time, Apple see this and they can capture the value from the supply chain and reinvest into the technology and innovations, which will improving their technical advance and continue the cycle.
And now I'm told I will present the first argument. Apple technical range creates asymmetric supply chain power. Now let's move on the common question. Why is Apple one of the most profitable company in the world? The main reason is that Apple offers valuable technology and very strong brand. And Apple has the iOS operating system, M series chip, and loyal customer base. And this advantage allow Apple to sell its product at a higher rate and earn much higher profits. According to the Counterpoint research in WSU 2023, Look at the picture. Apple show only 18% of all smartphones, and while Samsung show 81%. However, Apple generates 45% of the industry revenue and more than 80% of its operating profit. And this means that Apple doesn't need to sell the most phone to make the most money, and its technology and brand give the company a big competitive advantage. Because of its strong market position, Apple is a customer that many suppliers want to work with. For many companies, becoming an Apple supplier is a great opportunity, and they can receive a large order, stable income, and improve their reputation because they work with one of the world's biggest brands. And however, there is also a downside. When a company depends too much on Apple, its business also depends on Apple decision. And if Apple decides to produce fewer iPhones, supply will receive fewer orders, and this means they will earn less money. And in 2018, when Apple was reported to reduce the production plan for the iPhone XR, biggest shows their revenue by about 5%, and while Foxconn just by 3.6%, and this shows how much influence Apple has over its supplier. Because supply depends so much on Apple, the relationship between Apple and its supplier is not equal. Apple is one of the biggest buyers in the world, but there are many companies competing to become its supplier. And if one supplier cannot meet Apple requirement, Apple can simply choose another one. And this gives Apple very strong bargaining power. And as a result, Apple can ask suppliers to lower their prices, improve production quality, deliver products faster, and follow strict environmental and labor standards. And to keep working with Apple, suppliers usually have to accept this condition, even if it means making less profits. And as the supplier earn less profits, they face increased pressure to improve their efficiency, and they need to produce at a lower cost while still meeting Apple higher standards for quality and delivery. And to do this, many suppliers have to reorganize their production process and invest in automation and robotics. And now we will talk about the equipment too.
Hello everyone, I'm May and I will present the next part. So in the previous argument, we understand that the suppliers will adopt the Apple's demand due to the bargaining power. So from this, we have the second argument that when the suppliers adapt the Apple demands, they will restructure their production and the labor. So one of the most common pressure the supplier will have is the price and delivery timing from Apple. So the supplier will adopt this problem through two ways. The first one is labor flexibility. So this means that the supplier will adjust the number of labor or even the type of labor to save the cost or to boost the productivity. So take Foxconn is an example in this case. So Foxconn is recorded usually use the short-term contracts and the temporary worker with very little rotations. So these are the manifestation of the precarious, and we can also see that this is where the precarious appear in these situations. So another case is the Foxconn factory in China. They have more than 50% of the workforce is temporary worker, while the policy is only 10%. It proves that Foxconn primarily based on this type of worker to satisfy the requirement of Apple better. The second way they can do is enhancing mechanizations. So in the Apple report, they encourage the supplier to use more mechanics to increase the productivity. So from that, Foxconn now they invest very strong in robots like the Foxbot to replace some basic tasks, and from that it naturally reduced the number of needed labor for these positions. So this labor, when they leaving the company, if they cannot find a new job immediately, they will join into reserve labor. So we can see that these are where the precarious and the reserve labor appear in the case of Apple and the suppliers. So now we understand why labor flexibility and mechanization can create the increase of precarious and reserve labor. However, these two terms are not separate. They have a mutual relationship with each other. So let's look at the side of precariat. These are the people who have temporary work. So when their contract ends, they will join into the reserve labor to wait for new opportunities. Inside of the reserve labor, these people have the tendency to accept insecure jobs because they cannot work for the long term, and these jobs are not stable, so they naturally become a precariat. I have put many arrows here to have you understand the two-way transition between the precariat and the reserve labor. So the big question here is that is this relationship always sustainable? It will depend on one thing, insecure jobs. So once the group of reserve labor, they are they do not accept insecure jobs anymore. Instead, they find more stable jobs to apply for. They will not become a precariat. Um, but this is very hard to happen in reality because of the characteristic of this group. The people in the reserve labor are very easy to be replaced by the other people because they do not have to much professional skill and knowledge. So one way they can do to escape from this relationship is reskilling and upskilling themselves to apply for better jobs. So I have put the example of Apple and Foxconn here about the hiring season. In this period, Foxconn will hire more temporary workers to adopt the output of Apple requirements. So this is where the role of the precariat appear. And after this period, the worker will leave and they will join the reserve labor again to wait for new jobs. We usually think that precarious and reserve labor are negative. However, it's not. It will depend on different perspective. So in this case, Apple and supplier mostly benefits from this since the Apple can indirectly maintain their competitive production costs and flexible output adoption, which can ensure their profitability and the timeliness of order to the customer. And the suppliers who directly benefit from this since they can satisfy the production demand better, and they also can hire and lay off the worker easier. In contrast, the laborers who are the most and the people who receive most drawbacks in this situation because of many reasons like job insecurity, limited employment benefits, or unstable income. So we can see that even the supplier who the person take charge to restructure the production and labor, the worker are the people who receive the most detrimental impacts in this consequence.
So, building on Agreement 2, my agreement will explain how labor market dynamics help sustain and reproduce the unequal relationships between Apple and its suppliers. So, agreements here have shown that we carry out and resolve labor create a flexible labor pool. But why does this matter to Apple? So, when demand changes, suppliers can adjust their workforce and production capacity, and at the same time, they directly manage recruitment, temporary contract, and factory level changes. And this really fit with Apple outsourced production structure. So, according to the Apple 2025 10K, a significant majority of its manufacturing is performed by external partner. So Apple does not directly manage most productions. Instead, the suppliers will do it for them to keep the production moving, and this will give Apple three operational gains, which are productions can change as in scale, suppliers can respond faster to product cycles, and also since may reduce operating costs. So, but here is the key questions. When many parties help create value, do they all receive an equal share? So the answer is no. So the value creation is not the same as value capture. So a historical study of iPhone 4 estimated that Apple retained 58.5% of its wholesale value, while assembly labor cost in China just represented only 1.8%. This does not mean that Apple directly took the money from the workers. It shows that the contributing to reductions does not quantity equal value captures. Apple is in the stronger positions because it control the intangible assets, and these stronger positions will support the reinvest, like the Apple's R&D spending rose from $29.9 billion to the 34.6 billion in 2025, and that investment strengthened the technology in and intellectual property, which renew the technical rent. So the cycle's role closes. The technical rent create the power shape the supply adaptation, and flexible production create gains, and reinvestment renews the technical rent. But can supplier escape this unequal cycle? The next evaluations will answer that questions.
So for the first evaluation question, we look at whether the power imbalance between Apple and its supplier will always exist, or whether small suppliers can improve their positions. Our argument is that this imbalance is not permanent, but it is difficult to change. Some suppliers can gain more power if they develop skills or technologies that Apple cannot easily replace. Another way is that suppliers can work with more customers instead of depending mainly on Apple. This gives them more freedom and stronger negotiations power. Therefore, suppliers can improve their position, but only when they have something valuable and difficult to replace. However, for many suppliers, escaping this relationship is still very difficult. This is because Apple can provide very large orders, which encourage suppliers to invest heavily in factories, machines, and production systems designed for Apple. This investment makes suppliers more dependent on Apple because they not easily use their resources for other customers. If a project fails, suppliers usually face bigger risk because they have fewer alternatives. A good example is GT Advanced Technologies. GT invested heavily in sapphire production for Apple. However, when the company could not meet the Apple production targets, it faced serious financial problems and filed for bankruptcy in 2014. This shows that supply can become trapped, and when they depend too much on one large company. On the other hand, TSMC shows that supply can gain more power if they have unique advantage. TSMC has advanced chip production technology that is difficult to replace and work with many customers. Therefore, it has stronger bargaining power and is less dependent on Apple. Overall, the imbalance is not fixed, but escaping it requires suppliers to build unique strength and reduce their dependence on Apple. So the next evaluation is in the future, technology will be the main factor shaping the relationship between Apple and its supplier. As technology become more important, Apple can create more value from areas such as AI, cloud service, software, and chip design. By developing new technology, Apple can earn more from its knowledge and ideas, which help Apple maintain its strong position in the market. However, suppliers also need to change. They cannot continue using old production methods to continue working with Apple. They need to invest in between machine automation and worker skill. Therefore, technology development make both Apple and supplier more connected because they both side need each other. This relationship created a continuous cycle. First, Apple create a new technology, then supplier need to improve their production to meet Apple new requirement. Because Apple needs supplier to produce more advanced products, supplier become an important part of the Apple success. When Apple products are successful, Apple earn more value and invest more money into new technologies. As Apple continue to innovate, supplier must continue to improve. This cycle makes the relationship between Apple and supplier stronger over time. Overall, we believe that Apple and supplier will become more connected, but not necessarily more equal. Apple will still have stronger power because it controls important resources such as technology, product design, and the relationship with customer.
To conclude, the relationship between Apple and its suppliers can be explained by the concept of interconnected vessels. Apple's technical rent generated by its technology ecosystem and brand give the company a symmetric supply chain power. And as a result, suppliers must adapt by investing in automation and using more flexible labor, which increase both reserve labor and precariat. These changes make suppliers more responsive to Apple's demand and allowing Apple to capture more value and reinvest in uh, innovation. This creates a self-reinforcing feedback loop, and overall, Apple and its supplier are mutually dependent, but the relationship remains unequal because uh, Apple capture a much larger share of the value. And in terms of relationship between Apple and suppliers, supplier can improve their position, but high switching costs and dependent make it challenging to lift the relationship. They can improve bargaining power by developing unique capabilities and diversifying customer. And AI and advanced manufacturing technologies are likely to strengthen this relationship even further. Supplier will continue to innovate to meet Apple's standard, while Apple will maintain its leadership by creating more technical rent.